I see some people are trickling in. Welcome, everyone. I must say that this is one of my favorite Fridays in a long time. It's really fun to see you all here, and we definitely have very good company today. So I think we're going to get right into it. And so, as always, this is a time to ask questions. And so please, in the chat, you can start typing your questions right now if you want to for Olivier. And then I'm going to kind of help moderate and get those questions to Olivier as well. But first of all, as well, I want to, of course, welcome Olivier Sibony. It's such an honor to have you here. Welcome to these Habit Weekly Talks.
Thank you, Samuel. It's my pleasure.
Great. Well, while I'm awaiting some questions to trickle in, I have some questions of my own. and one specific question is I'm really curious to know, you having spent so much of your life, you can say, to understanding decision making, and have written some fantastic books on it as well. What does good decision making mean for you?
Well, we could have a lengthy discussion about that.
Yes, I'm sure.
I'm one of those people, and I'm sure you have met a few, for whom the answer is relatively simple. A good decision is a decision well made. It's a decision that has followed the right process, so that given the elements of information that you had at the time, or that you could have at the time under reasonable assumptions, and given a level of risk that you are willing to take, you have made a decision that gave you the best risk-reward ratio at the time you were making it. Then the outcome is another issue. Some of the good decisions that we make will have bad outcomes, and some of the good decisions that we make will have bad outcomes. And that's something that people in business struggle with, because we are so hardwired to think that it's the result that counts, and we evaluate people and the results they get. And there are some very sensible reasons for that. At the same time, we need to be able to distinguish a bad outcome that has nothing to do with the decision you made from a bad outcome that comes from having made the wrong decision. Otherwise, we're at risk of learning the wrong lessons and not learning the right ones. So to me, we should define a good decision as a decision well made.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into all of the things we're going to discuss today as well, because I think what you're mentioning in the process is a fascinating thing to consider, what makes for a good decision-making process. And what I would maybe think would be good to do, because I know several people here has probably read Noise, your more recent book, but maybe some people haven't. So could you maybe give a three-minute version of what is noise and why should we care about it?
Oh, with pleasure. So we are using the term noise in the latest book that Cass and Daniel Kahneman and I wrote in a very specific context. Noise means a lot of different things, and there is noise in statistics, and there is noise in the streets, and there are lots of types of noise. We mean noise as the unwanted variability of judgments. And unwanted and judgments are the keywords here. There is variability in all kinds of things that is very often quite welcome, and there is variability in judgments that is very often quite welcome. If you and I have different tastes about music, that's fine. There's no problem with that. If you and I vote for different political parties, that's okay. I mean, some in my view are more okay than others, and some in your view may be more okay than others, but that's pluralism. It's entirely welcome. If you and I are trying to solve a difficult, challenging scientific problem, and we take different routes to solve that problem, that's fine too, because in the end, we'll see what works, if any of these approaches work. Where it's a problem, where the variability becomes unwanted, is when we're making the type of professional judgments where we have a shared belief that there is a correct answer and that we shouldn't stray too far from it. So when two doctors make a different diagnosis, it's noise. when two judges look at the same person who's been convicted of a crime, and one of them says, that person should go to jail for 5 years, and the other says that person should go to jail for life. That's noise. When two fingerprint examiners look at the same pair of fingerprints, and one of them says it's a match, and the other says it's not a match, or worse, when the same examiner looks at the same fingerprints that he has seen 3 months ago and he had found to be a match and says it's not a match, that's noise. And the main finding that we cover in the book before we start talking about how to deal with noise is that wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and usually a lot more than we would think. So that's what we define noise as.
I can tell that you have had this question many times, because that was a very, very good answer.
Well, we thought about it for a long time. So we've been working on this book for a while, yes.
Yeah, that's great. And so we had one good question coming in terms of when working with behavioral science. Obviously, it's always this question coming back to the person and the situation, or the person and the context and so on. And just when considering noise, can you explain a little bit more how that relates to, call it the individual, as maybe how they're intrinsically making decisions and so on, and maybe how that individual's context might influence noise as well?
So context, again, can mean a lot of different things, but in the sense that you're using it here, Samuel, I think context is part of what we call noise. So let's take our judges again, right? And one of the studies that we talk about in the book, not one we did, one that was done 50 years ago. One of the studies we talk about is a study of judges, where some 200 federal judges look at the same cases. They actually look at simplified cases, at vignettes of cases, and they have very different judgments. Now, clearly, some of those judges, in their personal beliefs, in their personal belief system, in their personal values, their personal preferences, their personal context, as you would put it, are very different. Some of them believe that they are here to incapacitate dangerous criminals and to take them out of circulation for as long as possible. Others think that the mission of the judicial system is to rehabilitate those people and to help them get back on the right track. Clearly, if you have one belief system or the other, we might call this a different set of biases, if we wanted to, about these two judges, although we could dispute whether that's a bias or whether it's a legitimate opinion. But anyway, these judges are different, they have different contexts. If you look at it from the perspective of the justice system, or from the perspective of the defendant in this example, what you have is a blatant example of noise. Because which judge you happen to be facing is, in effect, a lottery. There isn't anyone in Congress or in whatever country you live in who has decided that justice should be a lottery. So the fact that there is such a large random element in the assignment of the judge, and that the choice of the judge is itself the determinant of such a large variation in outcomes, is clearly unwanted from the perspective of the system. Of course, and that's why the idea is a bit challenging. From the perspective of each one of these two judges, his or her own judgment is entirely justified. And they can come up with a long list of reasons and arguments to justify why it should be 5 years or why it should be life. But from the perspective of the system, we have to consider the fact that it could have been entirely different for reasons that are entirely unwanted and entirely random. That's why at the level of the system, of what we call system noise, these variations in context are actually sources of noise.
That's really helpful to understand that. And when it comes to, you mentioned before, how we can mitigate noise or overcome it in some ways, strategies for improving the process that we started with. What are maybe some ways that we can do it? Or do you have a good favorite example that you'd like to share?
Well, we have a few examples, and we cover a lot of them in the book.
Yes.
The basic theme, the sort of overarching idea, is what we call decision hygiene. It's the idea that when you make decisions, you should follow a sort of discipline, which, a bit like washing your hands, is good prevention. You will never know for sure that when you washed your hands a few minutes ago, you eliminated one particular germ or one particular virus, or or prevented one particular disease from affecting you. But you know that it's good prevention. And in the same way, the measures we recommend about noise are not designed to tackle a particular bias. They are not correctives to a particular problem. They are broad spectrum prevention against a number of problems. So here are a few examples. Here's one that I'm especially fond of. Structuring decisions. Now that sounds a bit boring and technocratic and so on. So here's a practical example of what structuring decisions means. You're a midwife or an OBGYN and you bring babies into this world. The big decision you've got to make when they are born is this baby healthy? And we can put it in her mother's arms and go have a drink to celebrate. Or does this baby need help? That's a decision that until a few decades ago used to be made holistically. It was a judgment, it still is a judgment, but that judgment was made holistically by the healthcare professional who would look at the baby and say, yeah, this baby is fine, or baby's got a problem here. So about 50 years ago, an anesthesiologist, I think, called Virginia Apgar, came up with a more structured way to make that judgment. She said, look, when I look at these babies and when my colleagues look at these babies, there's a number of things that they care about. They care about the color of their skin, they care about their pulse, they care about their reflexes. What if we codified each of those things? And what if there were 5 of them? And they actually started with the letter A, P, G, A, and R so that people would remember my name. That would be a nice twist to it. And so since then, basically everybody in the world uses the Apgar score to decide whether a baby is healthy. Now, it's still a judgment. When you say on the A criterion, the baby is all pink, or the baby is pink with blue extremities, or the baby is all blue, well, what's an extremity? How pink is pink? How blue is blue, right? It still takes expertise and judgment. But there is a lot less variability because professionals look at the same things. They have the same definition of what good, not so good, and bad looks like on each of those things. And so when a baby gets a score of 7, she's fine. When a baby gets a score of 6, she goes to neonatal care and gets taken care of, and we make a lot fewer mistakes. Do physicians complain that we've taken judgment out of their hands? I don't think so. I think they say, we get help. We have a guideline that helps us make a better decision. We've introduced structure into the decision. We've introduced a scale that tells us how to make decisions on the various elements of that structure. That's something that we can all take some inspiration from. In all the decisions that we make, introducing a bit more structure and a bit more discipline will tend to reduce noise and therefore will tend to reduce error.
That's a great example. I think it's a great example. And I just want to say for everyone who's come in recently, feel free to post your questions or raise your hand if you have any for Olivier. I have a lot of questions as well, but it's definitely a great opportunity to ask him your questions. So keep them coming. I wanted to kind of read you as kind of a sentence, and they say if that's correct or not in terms of somewhat like the goal of reducing noise. Would you say the goal is to get people to think and act in the same way? Is that the perfect world outside of removed from noise?
Well, the goal, of course, is to get people to think and act in the best possible way, right? So if in our medical example, all doctors acted in the same way, and the way was, let's give aspirin to anyone who shows up regardless of what they have, clearly that wouldn't be very good. We would have reduced right. any kind of noise, but we would have added a tremendous quantity of error in doing that. The way to think about, the way we think about this is error has 2 components. It's bias and it's noise. Bias is the average error. So when everybody makes the same mistake, it's a bias. When people on average make the same mistake, I should say, it's a bias. Then there is variability around that. That's noise. When we say what you just said, Samuel, which is we should try to make people less noisy, we should try to make people converge more on the same thing, variability between people is bad. A legitimate objection that people bring is, well, but if people are unanimous about the wrong decision, that's not so good. right? If we reduce noise, but we don't fix bias, we will have zero noise, and everybody will agree on something that is bad. Of course, that is a theoretical possibility. But two things, there's two things to say about that. The first is that is very unlikely, because once you remove noise, bias becomes very visible. Bias becomes very obvious when you have no noise. Noise, in fact, helps hide bias. I'll take a very simple example. Say you have a system in which you have people making hiring decisions, and they have gender biases. So some of these people, hopefully not all, but some of these people have a strong bias towards hiring more men than women. This is sometimes hard to see because they don't all see all the candidates. They don't all see a lot of women, and they don't all see a lot of men, and every candidate is different, and you always come up with a good story. If there was no noise and you could see in the system that all the interviewers behave in the same way, you would see that the average of their judgments is not consistent with what you would expect in an unbiased system. This would immediately become very visible. So it's in fact more likely that you will see bias and be able to fix bias once you have no noise. The second and slightly more theoretical objection, actually, I guess, is that analytically speaking, error is bias plus noise. When you reduce noise by a unit of 1, you have as much impact on error, properly measured as mean squared error, as when you reduce bias by an amount of 1. This is counterintuitive because we think of bias as something much more visible than noise, but in fact, noise is just as detrimental. So yes, we should try to go for a world in which people all think more or less like one another, but more importantly, on those decisions where variability is unwanted, just to be clear, that's not all decisions, but we should also try to make sure at the same time, of course, that we are not making them converge on the wrong answers, but on the right answers.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. And we have a great question that I think is nicely something I wanted to come to as well, which is from Gonzalo. Gonzalo, do you want to ask that yourself?
Too much pressure, Samu. Yes, of course. Hi, Olivier. Really nice meeting
Gonzalo.
you. And thank you for giving your time to us. The question is in relation to AHP algorithms to reduce noise, because we are using them right now in the process of identifying which behaviors inside of an intervention, of a behavioral intervention that we can do for an institution. We have to pick which behaviors we want to focus, right? And in order to rank them, to see in which one we start, we define variables on them. And we define, I don't know, cost, impact, whatever variable it is, and then people in the group by themselves, in order to not bias each other, give grades to this. And then once that happens, the algorithm ranks the behavior. And we try to do that in order to reduce noise. Do you think it's a good alternative? What else could we do?
In principle, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. But before I do that, let me be clear that I'm not an expert on AHP algorithms or any specific type of algorithm, so I can't answer to the specifics of the technical question. The principles behind what you're describing seem to me to be good in a couple of senses. First, having several people independently, and you stress that, and that's very important, independently grade different things and making separate judgments that are independent of each other and then aggregating those judgments is one of the key decision hygiene techniques, and one that is used, of course, in science and in algorithm development, as you point out, but very rarely used in organizations. Organizations tend to value discussion and debate and the creation of consensus, and that is the antithesis of the process you describe, where we actually elicit conflicting opinions and make sure that we hear the variety of the opinions before we aggregate them. So the spirit of what you're doing here is absolutely correct if what you want to do is to reduce noise. And it's, again, not natural in many organizations. The second idea that I find exciting in what you describe, or at least consistent with the principles of noise reduction, is in fact the idea of using algorithms. So when we talk about noise reduction, and when we say wherever there is judgment, there is noise, a lot of people jump from there to the conclusion that, well, we have the answer to that. Let's replace all judgment with algorithms. And we don't support that for reasons that we can get into in a moment, or that you can get into with Cass, since you will be talking to him afterwards. We don't think that all decisions should be made by algorithms. We don't think that all decisions can be made by algorithms anyway. But there is one thing about algorithms that we think has not sufficiently been noticed, and it is this. The reason algorithms perform so well, or one key reason algorithms perform so well, is that they are noise-free. There is a lot of debate about bias in algorithms, and it is absolutely true that algorithms can be biased and that we should be very careful about that. But whatever biases they may have, algorithms have no noise. And the main reason why even very simple algorithms, even very simple formulas, even very simple rules, even back-of-the-envelope calculations, when applied systematically, can perform pretty well compared to human experts, and sometimes better than them. The main reason for that is that those formulas do not add all the noise that human judgment adds when it tries to be subtle. So the principle of aggregation is a great one. The principle of using algorithms to the extent that you can and that it doesn't pose any other serious problems is also a great one. So what you're doing sounds great to me. I wish I could tell you more about AHP algorithms.
Thanks a lot, Olivier. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. And we have another question from Nuala. Nuala, do you want to ask that yourself as well?
Sure. Hi, Olivier.
Hi.
Probably a bit more of a complex question, I don't know. You talk about bias and you know the difference between bias and noise. And I know your other book is all about bias, so I think there's an interesting correlation there. But isn't not seeing noise just a bias? If that makes sense.
This is a great question, Noah, and we actually gave quite a bit of thought to why don't people notice noise? I'm talking about this problem here as if it's a huge problem and it's obvious, which it has become to me, but it wasn't obvious to me a few years ago. And a lot of people with whom we have this conversation say, well, it's interesting, I had never thought of noise as a big problem. And most organizations in which we diagnose noise and we say, look, you have a system noise problem, like the justice system in the example I was talking about earlier, right? Have no idea that noise is this big. So why are we incapable of hearing noise? Is it a bias? I'm not sure, but it certainly is a problem. Where does that problem come from? There's, I think, two reasons that compound each other, but that are a bit distinct. At an individual level, it's a psychological trait, I guess, that we don't imagine that people we respect and that people we think are completely reasonable could be looking at things very differently from how we look at them. We tend to think that people see the world in the same way that we see it because that's how the world is. So when a judge says, this defendant should spend 5 years in prison, the judge doesn't imagine that another judge who is in fact quite a reasonable person and who has also been appointed by someone to the same bench could say, no, it's life. We did something, this might be a question of values, so it may not be the best example, but here's another one. In an insurance company, you have underwriters who are supposed to set insurance premiums using the same norms and procedures and rules and techniques. And we found that the differences between them are considerably larger than they thought. And when we reported this back to them, they were flabbergasted. They had no idea. None of them ever thought that when he was saying this premium should be $100,000, the guy next door, given exactly the same facts, might say it should be $180,000. And that's the sort of difference that we're talking about. So the first reason is we simply don't put ourselves in the shoes of other people, or if we do, we don't imagine that it feels as different in their shoes as it feels in ours. And the second reason is the one I was hinting at when I was answering Gonzalo's question, which is that organizations do not really like to confront this problem. It's a bit embarrassing. If you're that insurance company and you discover that essentially the premiums that you set have been set by a lottery, because whoever got a premium of 180,000 might have gotten a premium of 100 if the guy next door had been in charge on that particular morning. That's a bit problematic. In fact, it makes a mockery of the whole process. So to avoid that unpleasant discovery, a lot of organizations tend to suppress the evidence. One great way to suppress the evidence is to not do what Gonzalo is doing with his algorithms, and instead to have people meet, chat, and gradually arrive without any overt conflict at a nice consensus that is somewhere in the middle of where people were, without ever exposing where they were at the beginning of the discussion. So organizations have this way of hiding noise under the rug, basically, that makes it hard to notice. I think these are the two reasons why we don't see noise, we don't pay attention to noise, and why there is so much surprise when we talk about it.
So the answer, to be fair, is it's different biases that prevent us from seeing noise.
It's a general bias of people towards not imagining the world not seeing that the world isn't as they think it is, but could be seen differently. That's sometimes been called naive realism. I think it's deeper than a bias, actually. It's a hardwired way in which we think, plus an organizational deficiency. Again, I'm loath to use the word bias in a loose sense. It's a problem. It certainly is a problem.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, great question. And another question here from Tim. He asks if you have any favorite examples of how decision hygiene can lead to better environmental or climate outcomes, and kind of relating to this, if there's any type of organizations within the kind of the sustainability space that might really benefit from focusing a little bit more on striving to remove and reduce noise.
So I can't think right now of examples of organizations in that space, which is not my specialty, that have reduced noise. We have some examples in the book of important issues around environment where there is a lot of noise in the judgments that people make. One example that you will find there is what should be the price of carbon. If we put a price on carbon, the estimates on this vary tremendously. At the end of the day, it's a judgment. That judgment makes a big difference. How should that noise be reduced and by whom it should be reduced is actually not just a problem of judgment. It's a political and an economic problem with deep ramifications that I'm acutely aware I'm not equipped to address. So I'll stop there and let you ask that question again of Cass. I'm sure he will have many more ideas.
Great. And when it comes to the general, I think something that probably everyone here has heard at some point is the idea of the wisdom of crowds. There's been obviously some research on this, and I think somewhat of a modern twist on this has been in the last decades, kind of this increase in prediction markets becoming more and more popular. How do you think about prediction markets and the wisdom of crowds in relation to noise and so on?
So we see it two ways. Crowds can be wise, or crowds can actually be terrible and create a lot of noise. And a big source of noise is actually the noise of groups with social influence. It's very important to distinguish, and organizations aren't always very good at doing that, a group of people who influence one another through hierarchy, through status, through the random order in which they speak, through different levels of knowledge, through accidents of the order in which the information is presented, groups that work in an undisciplined way and who think they are being wise because they are groups and because they are diverse and because they are putting more than one brain to the problem, with the best intentions, those groups will in fact add noise. They will amplify the noise that individuals already have in their judgments. It's very important to realize that, because quite often people, especially in business, say, oh, but we see the problem of noise, but we don't have that problem because we get together and we talk about it. Well, no, if you get together and you talk about it, you don't make things better, you make things worse. If you want to truly use the wisdom of crowds, and that's how the wisdom of crowds experiments are conducted, you need to make sure that you get the inputs from the various members of your crowd separately. And that doesn't happen by accident. It happens beautifully when you do an experiment where you show a jar of jelly beans to people and you ask them to input a number. That's easy. But in any organization I can think of, the opinions of the people who have seen a problem are somehow visible to other people who are looking at the problem. It's very, very hard. It takes express measures to hide the opinion of others from the people who are opining on something. I'll give you a practical example that struck me. Some time ago, I was working with a company that was very conscious of this. And in their hiring process, they were asking different people to rate the candidate, and they had an IT system. They had actually bought a system off the shelf in which people have to enter their comments on the candidate and put in grades on each of the dimensions that matter that have been defined in advance. So a textbook example of good decision hygiene, where the opinions are made, the judgments are made separately, they are structured, they're independent of each other, and only after people have put in all their inputs do they get into a room and discuss it. Looks perfect, conforms exactly to what we would recommend. And then I asked a question. After my boss has interviewed the candidate, can I go back and revisit my grades, the grades I gave the candidate, after I see what my boss has written down? And they said, yes, of course, we do it all the time. And the reason they were doing it is because the default in the system they had acquired was that this was allowed. Now, it was a very easy thing to fix, to change that setting. It was actually programmable. But they hadn't thought that this was a problem, because if you don't think about it explicitly, if you don't expressly make sure that inputs are independent of each other, the natural tendency of an organization is to seek consensus. So if I was the junior member of the team, of course, once my boss saw the candidate, I would go look what my boss had said, and I would change my ratings to avoid a complicated conversation because, hey, my standards are not high enough compared to yours. Well, no, that would be a problem. So it's just an example, but it goes to show how difficult this is.
That's a great example. And yeah, for sure. And so how then do you think about something like, I'm curious because obviously it's very much in the conversation about decision-making recently with super forecasting and the work of Philip Tedlock and so on. How do you think about how a process of a super forecaster compares to, that might be more individual often compared to what you would have in a good decision hygiene or an organization? Do you see some form of overlap or?
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah.
And we have a whole chapter on super forecasters and experiments about them. And yes, in the techniques that Phil Tedlock and Barb Mellers and their team have applied to improve the quality of the super forecasters' judgments, there's a few things. First of all, they select the people who have the best forecasting skills. Those are the super forecasters by definition. So at that point, as you said, Samuel, it's an individual thing. It's not a group thing. Then they tried a few things. They said, what about if we ask them to team up? And that actually improves their outcomes. Because when these people team up, they are quite good temperamentally and in the way they work because they are separate from each other physically. They are quite good at actually forming opinions independently, then pooling them, then making sure, that way making sure that, oh yes, Samuel, you've seen something that I hadn't seen. I'm going to revise my judgment. So that improves things. There's another thing that they found improves things a bit, which is to give them training on the cognitive biases that might affect their thinking. But when you look at how, and this is a bit complicated analytically, but we describe in the book how they do it. when you look at how those different things improve the quality of the forecasts, they always improve the quality of the forecasts by reducing noise in the forecasts, not by reducing bias, not by increasing the information that people have access to, or not so much, always by reducing noise. At the end of the day, what makes a super forecaster super is the mindset of trying to reduce noise. And we thought it was a fascinating example of how you can improve the quality of a judgment, in this case, a forecast, through a combination of selecting people with the right mindset, and that mindset is very important. The mindset of the super forecasters is essential, but also grouping them in teams where they're going to be able to bring different perspectives and to use some of that aggregation, so that averaging that we also see in the wisdom of crowds.
Very interesting. And so when it comes to, I guess, then dealing with bias, because we have obviously talked about it today, but not so much maybe directly, because what you're speaking to is something very interesting, and that, they're supposed to be trained to reduce their bias by being more knowledgeable and more, or maybe having stronger salience to certain biases that might show up. But that didn't contribute to lesser bias, but more just reduce the noise. How do you think about reducing bias, if that's an intervention you want to make? Is that possible? If so, how?
So it's a little bit tricky to reduce bias, and there's been research on debiasing for decades, and some people say there are some successes here and there, but I think it's fair to say, if you have to summarize it in one sentence, that with exceptions, it's proven to be extremely difficult. Why is that? It's interesting to ask why that is. I think the easiest answer is because unless you are actually looking at a controlled experiment on biases in a very controlled environment, it's actually very hard to know in advance which bias is going to derail your thinking. If you're making an investment, if you're a big company and you're trying to decide whether to make an investment in a new business, are you underinvesting because you're a victim of status quo bias and sunk cost in your existing business and all those other biases that lead you to be too conservative? Or are you likely to overinvest because you're overconfident about the plan that you're making and you have exaggerated optimistic views about the new business you're about to invest in? Before the fact, it's very hard to know that. What people typically do is they look at mistakes after the fact, and when someone has invested and failed, they say, well, the guy was overconfident. And when he has invested and succeeded, they look at his competitor and they say, that guy was a victim of status quo bias, he should have invested too. So of course, after the fact, we can always pick the bias that explains a mistake. But before the fact, we don't know what mistake we're going to make, because we don't know, except in very specific situations, what biases we're at risk of falling for. We think that there's one possible avenue here to reduce bias, which under certain circumstances, and we are quite prudent about, we try not to be overly optimistic about it. We call this decision observation. If we think that we had some experiences where when you appoint someone to observe the process of the decision making and to highlight in real time the impression that some biases are actually present in the decision making, you might be able to catch those biases at the time they're influencing your decision. But there's a limit to how much you can do that. You can imagine all the challenges that this poses in a group or in an organization. So in general, we are much more inclined to say, fix your decision-making process, introduce some hygiene into it. That will reduce noise. That will also reduce some biases. Don't try to look for the bias that is going to affect you, because it's very hard to predict in advance.
Right. Yeah, I look at the time and I feel like there's so many things here we can dip into even more, but this has been, such a fantastic and enlightening 40 minutes or so. And I want to end on a little more personal note, if you will, in that I think we all have had strange experiences within the last 18 months of pandemic and so on. But I know that you spent probably a lot of hours on Zoom with Danny Kahneman writing noise. So how was that? How has that changed you, or how was that experience? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't mean to, I don't mean to sound. It's hard to say that COVID had a silver lining for anyone, because it's such a horrible situation for a lot of people. But for us, it's actually helped in a bizarre way, which is that we'd been working on this book for many years. And the process was that basically I would go spend a week every month in the US, and sometime Danny would come and spend a week in France, and we'd work for a week, and then we'd go back and write drafts and send them and so on. And having to work on Zoom just reduced the cycle time so much that what we did in a week, we started doing in a day. It made us a lot more productive. It doesn't work for everything. I'm certainly not one of those people who say, we've discovered that we can do everything remotely and offices are dead and people aren't ever going to go to the office anymore. I think that's nonsense. But in our case, at the stage we were in the writing of this book, it would have been different if we had been in the first year, not in the fourth year. Right? But at the stage we were in the writing of this book, it was actually a big help. So it was a lot less fun than having those week-long meetings with a lot of meals interspersed in them. It was a lot less social and exciting, but it was a lot more efficient. So
there we go. Yeah, I can imagine. And the circumstances in this scenario is funny, because now I'm just inviting Cass on the call as well. And
here he is, actually connecting right now, right on time, as he always is.
Yes, it looks like that.
Here is the amazing Cass Sunstein.
Hello.
Hi, Cass. You have probably at least one familiar face here. Olivier here is here to greet you.
Indeed, I was about to say goodbye and leave the floor to you, Cass. So over to you.
I was about to do the same.
Yes, well, I really want to say that, Olivier, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate your time. There's so many enlightening insights from this 45 minutes that I'm sure everyone here can take away. And
it's nothing compared to what you're going to get from Cass in the next 45 minutes. So you guys, this was fun. Thanks a lot for the great questions. They're a lot better than those I get most of the time, I can tell you. Take care.
Great. Take care, Olivier. All the best. Yes. And welcome, Cass. How are you today?
I'm very good. How are you doing?
Very good. As you can tell, we've had a nice 45 minutes just before this, speaking to a co-author of yours. So yeah, it's been good.
Great. He's great. If you have him, I don't think you need me. You don't need you.
Well, he said the same, so I don't know. You're both, I think, very humble in that. So I think if nothing else, we do have some things from that conversation where actually he encouraged us to ask the same questions to you as well. But first of all, I just want to welcome you. This is a opportunity for people that are interested in using behavioral science in practice, especially, to get a chance to ask questions to someone like you who's been doing all areas of behavioral science from the more academic side to the practical side, and both public and private. So there's going to be some questions coming up in the chat that I'm going to put forward to you as well. But first of all, I want to ask you on the topic of where we're coming from now. We've been talking a lot about noise, as you can probably imagine. And you have operated quite a bit of time both in university settings and in government settings. So from that standpoint, in your experience, where do you see noise in those two contexts, if you will, most often?
Well, it's all over both private and public institutions. So in medicine, there's a great deal of noise. Doctors often behave differently depending on whether it's the morning and the afternoon, or depending on whether they're tired or energetic, or depending on whether they're in a good mood or a distressed mood. So that's noise within the doctors. It's also the case that in the system of criminal justice, I'm a lawyer by training, there's a great deal of noise. So one judge might say, you get 5 years in prison, and another judge might say, unless something is done to cabin the noise, another judge might say you get 3 months in prison. So criminal sentencing is noisy. Our administrative apparatus in many nations is noisy in the sense that if someone is a polluter, they might be fined a certain amount, depending on the lottery of who ends up being the public official who assigns the fine. And that could be much higher than what they could get if they had another person in charge of deciding on the magnitude of the fine. So medicine and law are replete with noise. The administrative state has noise. If people are saying they're disabled, it might be in some nations a lottery that whether they get disability benefits depends on who's the person who's entrusted with the adjudication. And that is unfair and a contributor to mistakes. Yeah,
it certainly sounds like there's no shortage of it. And I'm going to let people to drop questions in the chat, but we have 2 questions that I wanted to take with us from our conversation with Olivier. And the first one was in regards to algorithms. So we talked a little bit about it, but one thing we didn't really get a chance to discuss too much is maybe why we don't want to have algorithms guiding all of the decisions. So what is the kind of, why is not algorithms the answer to all of our problems when it comes to this?
It's a great question, and let's go at it, kind of march up a hill and then down a hill. So sure. I noticed that when a speaker, including yours truly, says some nice things about algorithms, people get a little sad and a little mad. And when a speaker, including yours truly, says some things against algorithms, people nod in assent and make their day a little bit better. And I really want to go against the grain on that, because there's a kind of tendency to rejoice at algorithm bashing, and also a tendency to close your ears at approving of algorithms. So let's go up the algorithm hill, and I want to say that this march up the algorithm hill is the more important part of the remarks I'm going to be giving. Down the hill is a little like saying dropped objects fall, and I'll try to make it interesting, but it's a little too pleasing. An algorithm is a disciplined way of ensuring that decisions are made by reference to rules rather than case-by-case judgment. So if an infant is born, in many nations, there's something called an APGAR score, where a rule-like judgment is made based on 5 criteria, and numbers are assigned, and it's like an algorithm, and it makes judgments about the health of a little one much less noisy. So there isn't variability across people, and it also makes the judgments much less biased. So the optimistic bias or pessimistic bias or availability bias, all of these are somewhere between greatly reduced and eliminated by reference to the algorithm-like APGAR score. If you have an algorithm that predicts whether people have heart disease based on certain indicators, and the algorithm is making a statistical assessment, it will be less noisy than a doctor who might be affected by mood or might be affected by relative proclivity to find heart disease. And some doctors are more proclive, let's invent a word. Some doctors are more proclive than others to find heart disease. And an algorithm will be free of it. It's also the case that doctors can be biased in their judgments. They might be optimistic, they might be pessimistic, they might be affected by what happened in the last week, and algorithms will not. So algorithms tend to be noise eliminators. That's a very good thing, and that's part of what they too. They also can be, and I don't want to say anything more firm than that, they can be relatively less biased than human beings. And I'm speaking here of cognitive biases. And insofar as they're making statistical associations, that is, given factors A, B, and C, what is the likelihood that X is present? They should be free from the cognitive biases to which human beings are subject. So that's really good. And for the purposes of the inquiry into noise, it's not just good, it's fantastic. Okay, if algorithms aren't good, even though they reduce noise, we can get a clue as to why by virtue of a chess program I played on Air France a number of years ago, where the chess program, it was the easiest version because I'm a bad chess player, so I chose the easiest program to play. I learned quickly that the program had one rule, which was put the other player in check. Do whatever you can to put the other player in check. That was the algorithm's rule. And that was a heuristic, put the other player in check heuristic, which led to a bias, put the other player in check bias. And though I'm a pretty bad chess player, I could always beat the algorithm because it used the bad heuristic. So you can program an algorithm so it's noise-free. You could even program it if you wanted to, so it would be noisy. So that would have to be a deliberate and somewhat perverse choice. You could certainly, under most circumstances at least, you can program it so it has a heuristic in it. And programmers typically wouldn't want to do that. That would be not a very good decision. But you could have an algorithm that is not attuned to relevant features of a situation. So it might be predicting, for example, whether people are going to suffer from depression. And it could be just that there's some factor in it, let's call it where they live, which is relevant to whether they're going to suffer from depression. And it's just programmed not to consider that. But a human judge maybe would consider that. So if you're in some place, there's a greater propensity to depression, and human beings might be attuned to that. So when algorithms go wrong, it's often because they are not attuned to something which human beings have programmed them not to be attuned to. And that can lead to serious mistakes. And we can imagine cases in which they would behave worse than human beings would.
That's a great answer. And I also feel happy that I'm not the only one who is bad at chess. And I learned that after watching Queen's Gambit when I was popular last year to try my simulator as well to learn about chess. But I don't know if I actually beat much of the simulations even. So you did better than me. But that's a great example. That's a really great example. And looking at noise specifically in one sector, we had a question before on if you have any examples if you noticed where noise was in some ways reduced or where it was tackled in the sustainability and environmentalist sector. Have you seen any examples of attempts to reduce noise to improve outcomes there?
I certainly have. So let me give, I think I'll give 3 examples. The most important number that most people have never heard of is the social cost of carbon. So the social cost of carbon is the economic damage, the monetized economic damage done by a ton of carbon emissions. And it's a really important number because in many nations, the stringency of greenhouse gas regulation will be either determined or influenced by the social cost of carbon. So if the damage done by a ton of carbon emissions is 200 euro, then you will have stringent regulation compared to the level of regulation you'd have if it was 15 euro. Social cost of carbon might be the determinant of carbon tax, or it might be the determinant of how you regulate coal-fired power plants or automobiles or any domain in which greenhouse gas emissions are involved. In the United States, when I worked under President Obama, we noticed, it wasn't hard to notice, that there was a lot of noise with respect to the social cost of carbon, that different agencies at different times would have different numbers, and also that different agencies would have different numbers. So one ministry might have a low number and another ministry might have a high number. And that's ridiculous that different parts of the same government have different social costs of carbon. And it's like a scale, which if it weighs you such that you're too heavy compared to how you actually are half of the time and too light compared to how you actually are half of the time, you're going to make mistakes on both sides. And that's what happened with the social cost of carbon. So in the US government, I co-led a process, this was well before we did the book, but which was designed to eliminate noise with respect to the social cost of carbon. And it's approximately, in 2021 money, it's in the vicinity of 50 euro. And that's what it was under Obama. Biden, shortly after taking office, did exactly the same thing. There's a process underway to come up with a new social cost of carbon based on the latest science and economics. And whatever it is, it will be noise-free because it'll be one number. That's example number one in the domain of environment and sustainability. The second example is, suppose you have a regulation that's designed to prevent deaths from air pollution. Particulate matter is especially not good air pollutants. And suppose you prevent 200 deaths. What's the monetary value of that? To do that, you need a value of a statistical life. That's the necessary number. It's in the same extended family as the social cost of carbon, and it's a really important number. It also raises many empirical and ethical questions. Let's just bracket those and notice if different agencies use different values of a statistical life, different ministries. If the transportation ministry uses 15 million euro and the environmental ministry uses 2 million euro, it's chaos, and it'll be like the scale that shows you. And again, the government with which I'm familiar, the United States, has a relatively uniform, not exactly uniform, but relatively uniform value of statistical life, which is in the vicinity of 10 million euro. And that dramatically reduces noise. The third example I'm going to use more loosely because we need to do some research to do it less loosely. And that is in the domain of fines for polluters. There have been occasional efforts to introduce guidelines such that it isn't noisy, so that one polluter faces a very severe fine and another polluter faces a very light fine. And the difference just depends on who's the public official who's making the decision. And guidelines with respect to fines are a way of making sure that when people pollute unlawfully, they aren't subjected to a lottery and the system isn't so noisy.
Great examples. That's fantastic. That helps clarify some of that really well. And I'm very tempted to stick with noise and continue asking noise questions, but I kind of want to segue a little bit away from noise, at least for the time being. We had a great question here from Gonzalo, and you are clearly someone who's been, again, seen so many sides to behavioral science and practice in various settings. And so we've obviously talked about the process that can reduce noise, but I want to talk a little about the process to design a behavioral science intervention. And so the question from Gonzalo is regarding this, I think, recurring thing that we're all facing with, that behavior is very complex. The world is very complex. We often need some form of model or framework to try to understand a little bit better the world and the behavior within it. And so when you work with crafting an intervention, is there certain models or framework that you're kind of leaning against more often than not? Or how do you think about that part of what it means to be a behavioral scientist?
Okay, thank you for that. And God has a sense of humor, so that as you were asking the question, we faced a behavioral issue which was that I hadn't turned off my email notifications. And so the question was, what is the right remedy for that problem? And it's pretty straightforward. The problem was, you'll be thrilled to hear, that I hadn't logged out of my email program. And the remedy was to log out of my email program. Now that's a little bit of a ridiculous example, but it's instructive, I think. So suppose the problem is that the take-up rate for some program is 40%. Let's suppose it's a program that's designed to help poor people to get access to job training, and about 40% of them take up. A light bulb should go off in the head that says that automatic enrollment is likely to be a very effective remedy, though we need to do two kinds of work. One is finding out whether the complexity or sludge in signing up is actually the driver of that 40%. And another is we have to do some legal and practical work to understand whether we could shift to automatic enrollment. And if we did, we would need at least some information about whether you're going to see a very high opt-out rate, which is contrary to what standardly happens. So the problem as specified is low take-up rate, and the solution as specified is shift to automatic enrollment. Or it might be the case that the problem is vaccine hesitancy. And we know from behavioral research that there are three things that are principal contributors to vaccine hesitancy. One is a lack of convenience, another is complacency, and a third is distrust. And we would want to study in the circumstances whether the population that's vaccine hesitant is mistrustful or complacent or just like really busy. And that would help us figure out what the right remedy is. If the problem is that people aren't buying, let's say, energy efficient appliances, and that results in environmental costs and also foregone savings for consumers, then we have some sense maybe that people don't have adequate information about the benefits, or that the information, even if it's available, isn't sufficiently salient. And then we have clues about what the right remedy are, provide salient, clear, available information. And so there's a diagnosis exercise. And often for purposes of business and government, it's really not that hard. Sometimes it's hard, but often it's not that hard. And it naturally leads to a solution set. And the beauty and cruelty of the world is that some of the solutions might not work, even though they work in other contexts. And then we test them. We see whether making information salient with respect to, let's say, energy efficient appliances actually has an impact. If it doesn't, then we probably got the diagnosis wrong, that maybe people don't like those energy efficient refrigerators. Maybe they don't work very well. Maybe they're not very attractive. And then we have a design problem, which isn't strictly speaking a behavioral design problem. It's a refrigerator design problem.
Right. So to paraphrase, if I understand you correctly, you in some ways let the problem dictate some of the process in terms of, rather than following just one set of, like one type of model or framework in all settings, it's a little more based on what is the current, diagnosed problem and how can we best solve for that? Yeah.
Yeah, it would be. So when I worked, I'm in the government again, but when I worked in my previous position, it was shortly after Nudge was published. And I learned very quickly that if I was ever tempted to say, let's use behavioral science and less Nudge, the likely response would be, why don't you go back to Harvard and stop trying to work for the government? Wouldn't be very enthusiastic about behavioral science, nudging. It's too, what's the right word? It's adjectives and nouns. So instead of adjectives and nouns, solve a problem. So in my previous stint in the government, one problem was that we really wanted people for environmental reasons to purchase environmentally better cars and more fuel efficient cars. And why weren't they doing that? One reason was our label that was on cars was opaque and uninformative. So we had a process by which we improved the label significantly with reference to such data as we could acquire. And to iterate that, to make sure you keep having the best label, if that's the tool you have, is a good idea. But this is really exciting, I think, that there's a diagnostic process that precedes the choice of intervention. It may be, let's think about vaccinations. There's a view among some behavioral scientists that there are a number of nudge tools that are promising, but for some populations, they're not promising enough. And given the challenge, which involves not only risk to self, but also risk to others, a mandate is a good idea. And that's a view that some behavioral scientists hold. And then we have a behavioral question, which is once we impose some kind of mandate, let's say, how do we make it work? And it may be that there's a large employer who says you can work here only if you are vaccinated, but the employer doesn't want to be firing people. It wants people to say, okay, I'll get vaccinated. And that's a behavioral question. And we know a few things about what would help. More convenience, addressing complacency head on, and responding to distrust.
That's great. I want to remind people who are just coming on as well that feel free to post your questions. I'm going to try to get into a little bit of what you've been mentioning now in terms of nudge and sludge, and both of those two, starting with nudge. So if you have specifically any nudge or sludge related questions, please share in the chat. But yeah, I think I speak for everyone that most people on this call have some form of personal relationship with the book Nudge in terms of, it was a while ago that it first came out, but I still remember kind of the cafe I was in when I started reading it and so on. I'm sure many people can relate on this call. But then this year, something happened, which was that there's a new edition of it. And so I guess the general question that I'd be curious to know more about is just what has changed from the first publication to this one, and why did you feel the need to republish and add some new things to it?
Okay, so the story is a little funny that we learned sometime, maybe early summer of last year, that the contract for the paperback of the book in Europe and the United States had expired a year before, and nothing had been done with the contract expiring, which is itself a behavioral finding of, let's say, limited attention and maybe unrealistic optimism. So we had to do a new contract. And the publisher said, would you do maybe a bonus chapter or a foreword or an afterword? And I thought that was a very good idea, and it would be fun. And both of us had materials. Dick's Nobel lecture was one, and I had a paper called Misconceptions About Nudges, which I thought would be useful, maybe use that as bonus materials. And then we started to read through the book, and we noticed that it had things about technologies that didn't exist anymore. From Apple from a long time ago, and it also had some solutions to problems like same-sex marriage. We had an idea we kind of liked, which was privatize marriage and make it all civil from the state, but religious and other organizations, they can marry people as they choose. But people had found a way to solve this problem that was a lot simpler than our suggestion, which was just recognize same-sex marriage. So that chapter seemed a little out of date. And as we saw the out-of-dateness, we kind of got excited about doing a revision that would update everything. And this became a little like remodeling a house, where you decide, I think we need a new table in the kitchen. And then you say, well, actually the kitchen's kind of broken down and we maybe should expand the size of the kitchen, knock on a wall. And then you say, well, the backyard, it's really kind of ugly and we need a remodeling of the backyard. And then eventually you're redoing the entire house. We think there's a behavioral bias there that we ourselves fell subject to, called the home remodeling bias. And we decided as we went through the chapters that the climate change problem we touched on not adequately. And we needed to do a lot more about that. And so the climate change chapter, which is one of the features of the final edition, is almost completely new. We also hadn't said anything about sludge, which was a concept both of us had been thinking a lot about. And so we had a lot of fun doing a chapter about that. We had a chapter on organ donation, which was widely misunderstood. People thought we were in favor of opt-out. We weren't, but it was also out of date, and the whole topic is extremely interesting and largely revealing about nudges and choice architecture. We also thought that the topic of choice architecture generally is something we hadn't adequately identified. We were and are focused on nudging, but the idea that every problem is a choice architecture problem and the solution might not be nudging, it might be like a mandate or a ban, that was something that we hadn't dealt with enough. So on the financial side, with respect to consumer protection, we liked what we did before, but we thought, those people knew so much less than the current authors do. And while we are hopeful we'll know a lot more in 10 years than we knew 10 years ago, I'm hopeful we're able to do better, or let's say less bad than we did that.
Right. I'm curious to ask you, because I had a conversation earlier this week with two researchers, Lydie Klotz and Gabe Adams, and they had looked into this idea of our bias towards addition rather than subtraction. That when trying to solve problems, we seem to be somewhat biased to adding things rather than trying to remove things. Did you experience a similar thing here, instead of like removing some things, but that can obviously be good, but also maybe having a little bit too much focus on adding more? Or how did you think about that?
So the book, I think the book's a little longer now. So we may have fallen prey to the bias of adding, but we did delete some chapters. From the United States edition in particular, we deleted a chapter on how to deal with medical malpractice. I wanted to keep it originally because I like it and make it better, but Dick has extremely good judgment. So I think he was probably right.
Nice. So I have a nice question from Nuala. Do you want to ask that yourself, Nuala?
Sure. Hi, Cass. You have 1 million books, and every time we look at the bookstore, there's another one. And I'm thinking, I don't know what time you have on your hands, but it must be a lot. Or you've got a big bank. But my question was really, you've written so many. Do you enjoy it? I'm assuming you do, but you may not. You may feel some compulsion to keep adding to your list. And really, what topics are of interest now? Because you write a lot about information. You've written about a lot of different, pretty current things. But do you have something that you would want to write about that may not sell? Which I think is a different point. The ones you write about, can be commercial and they appeal to a bigger audience. But is there anything that you actually, in a free world, would just love to write about, and it may not be of interest in a mass market capacity?
Thank you for that. So since February, I've been working in the government, February 7th, I think, and I've done essentially no writing, and definitely no writing on books I write memoranda these days, and I do miss it. So the fact that I have far too many books out is a product of enjoyment. I completely love writing. And there are several books that are on my computer that no one will ever see because they're terrible. But I enjoyed finding out that they were terrible. In terms of next projects, I've been so focused on my government job that I haven't really thought about what I'll do once I'm a civilian again and get to write books. But there are a million things that interest me. One topic that I've been thinking about a bit is adaptation, and that it's both a blessing and a curse. So that the fact that we have all, this is just a recent example, adapted to a COVID situation, which would have been unfathomable that we could adapt to like a week before we started. And many people are very comfortable with what they've adapted to. I think that's profoundly interesting and tells us something about our species. And the fact that we can adapt to things that are quite terrible is also a curse, because then to fight for something that isn't terrible might be too tiring or seem pointless because it's fine. The terribleness is all of a sudden fine. So I'm keenly interested in the topic of adaptation.
Oh, very good. And if I might just go back to those books that are terrible, the ones that no one's ever going to see, who decided they were terrible? And was it the topic, or is it something that you actually, because they obviously weren't so terrible, you chose to write about them, would you go back and redo them at another point? Because you obviously liked whatever it was you were writing about.
Thank you for that. So I signed a contract maybe 8 years ago to write a book on liberty. I ended up doing another very short book, but it tells you something, I think, about how at least some people proceed. The topic of liberty, the publisher wanted a big book, meaning an ambitious, theoretical, but also, it was a commercial publisher, accessible book on the concept of liberty, how to think about liberty. And I worked on it for several years, and it's too big, and it's a topic rather than a thesis or a point. And it made me feel, what is the right word? Bored. So it's weird, just I think, to think that the idea of liberty is boring. It isn't, but my writing on it was boring. And so I gave up on the ground that though I had a lot of pages, none of them had the right kind of energy. And I ended up doing a little book called On Freedom, really short book, which is about the problem of navigability. Now that makes me smile. And the reason is it goes at the problem of liberty from a specific angle, a little sideways. I like going at problems sideways. And it's about the challenge of getting from one place to another, and how if you can't, you're lost. And that's a form of unfreedom. And as I started to work on that, I started to feel I was flying a little bit. And with the big topic, which I felt my feet were stuck in mud.
It's interesting. Thank you very much. It's just too big. It's a very good point. If you go too big, you just can't get anywhere. Yeah.
If you go, so I have a short-ish book on conformity, which is also a big topic, but I love doing that because I had an angle on it that felt it had energy. If it was lamenting conformity or celebrating conformity in some big sense, I'd think, someone should go on TV and do that, but not me.
Right. Well, thanks, Noala. That was a great question, because I was going to ask you as well, actually, towards the end, but this is great to get this, because like Noala said, you have indeed written a lot of books. I just counted the last decade, and I think I got to around 25 or so that's been published. And so just a quick question on your writing process, because you have as much time as anyone else, and I'm sure some people might even be glad to read 25 books in, in the last decade. So what is your writing process for making sure that you get into a place and time and context where you can write well?
So now these days, and in this year, I have no writing process because I'm working in our government, but I can recollect those days when I had a writing process. And usually in the morning, I would have a project and I would start at it. And if I was stuck, I'd keep writing until I was not stuck. So President Obama had a phrase he told the speechwriters, which is, you can't edit a blank page. And as soon as I heard that that's what he said, I thought that's basically how I proceed. So let's suppose I were writing, I have a gleam in the eye about writing something on John Stuart Mill in my off hours right now. And I have a little bit of an idea. I'll tell you, it's called Missing Mill, and it's meant as a pun. And I have an idea that I've written a lot about Mill, and I think I've missed the heart of Mill. And what I'd like to start by saying is the familiar Mill was an idea about the reach of government. And then I trace that and say what's good and not so good about it, and then say what Mill is really about. And I think what Mill is really about, the music of Mill, has to do with his forbidden relationship with Harriet Taylor, which was illicit, and his celebration of experiments in living and individuality, and people's ability to realize their own capacities. It's a romantic conception in two ways. First, it's literally romantic. It's about his romance. And second, it's about the romantic tradition. And that is not about the limits of the state. That's about the human soul. And you can see, I think, my enthusiasm for it. And I have it a little bit in my head how to get started. And I'm quite confident that I can get started. And I'm quite confident it's not going to be good enough, but I will revise it 1,000 times until it's at least better than it started.
I love that. It's always fun when you talk about unexpected things. I don't think anyone here would expect to hear, for example, John Stuart Mill's being mentioned today, but that's really lovely. Thanks for sharing that and a little more on your process. I would feel amiss to not mention a little bit more on Sludge, because that was officially, I think, your latest publication. And so I'm guessing that might have been something that was meant to be an extra chapter to Nudge that became a little more than an extra chapter, perhaps? Or can you tell us a little more about why you think Nudge deserves its own little book? It's quite nice. It's quite a nice, shorter book in terms of, it's not so, we talked about some daunting, scary books to read, but that's a very kind of nice read, I think. Right. But tell us a little bit more why that's important to write about as well.
So I did a book called Too Much Information a year or two ago, which has a short chapter on sludge, which grows out of work about frictions and paperwork and waiting time imposed by government, grows out of academic work. And the editor of the book at MIT Press said, this is really interesting, you should do a book on sludge. And I love the topic and the pervasiveness of frictions that make workers' lives much worse, that make consumers struggle, that make it so that if you're old or sick or poor, your ability to get what you have a legal right to is often compromised. That when she said do a little book on that, I thought that was great. And I'll tell you something we haven't talked about publicly. I said to Dick Thaler, do you want to do this together? Because we've both been thinking about it. And he I think what's one of the part of his genius is he's kind of lazy, and he won't do things unless they are clearly going to be tremendous fun for him and maybe tremendous, So he's not as prolific as many, but everything he does basically is fantastic. And he went back and forth, and then he said, you do it yourself. And we were completely in a genial way. So I did. And then actually long after I had embarked on that book, we decided to revise Nudge. And of course, we were going to have a chapter on Sludge in that book. The book Sludge was written before the chapter on Sludge in Nudge. And the book is basically a manifesto for for sludge reduction, and it goes in some depth into the magnitude of the problem of sludge, the reasons why sludge for Homo sapiens is such a serious obstacle, and the importance of sludge audits. It urges that sludge reduction isn't part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it has a claim to be. And I've worked actually since I started on this with the United Nations on sludge reduction. And at the highest level, meaning Secretary General, there is real interest in making processes work better for people by cutting the sludge.
And I forgot to ask you as well, could you define sludge? Because maybe some people are a little bit more newer to that than Nudge as well.
Thank you for that. So sludge consists of frictions or administrative burdens that prevent people from getting what they have a right to or from arriving at their preferred destination. So if you have to fill out a long form to get a permit to do something, that's sludge. If you have to face a 3-week waiting period before you get, say, a visa or access to a program, that is sludge. If you have to go in for an in-person interview, that is sludge. If you have a waiting period of any sort before your online application, let's say, is approved, that is sludge. So think of it as frictions or burdens that eat up time, that insult human dignity, and that in many cases operate as a kind of wall between human beings and something that can make their life much better.
Right. So, for example, I was excited to watch the new James Bond movie this weekend, but we've forced to do something else. And so in this scenario, I have to refund the tickets. But I realized today that the only way for me to refund tickets will be to go to the cinema physically. I could book the ticket online, but I had to go to the cinema to refund them. Is that a good example, would you say?
Sludge. Your rights were violated. Not literally, but that was not the best business practice. Less sludge.
Yeah,
and some cases, you know, for getting vaccinated in some countries at some stages, there's a lot of sludge. That's terrible.
And have you come across the term dark patterns?
Yes, and dark patterns are related to sludge. Some dark patterns are sludge. The category of dark patterns is heterogeneous and includes things that are pretty terrible and some things that are more innocuous. So one form of sludge is if you can easily enroll in a program, it's sludge free to get it in. But if getting out involves, you know, making sure your mother and your father actually travel to both Stockholm and Beijing to talk to the authorities there, that is sludge to get out of a program. And often less than scrupulous private actors allow very easy access and extremely difficult exit. And that's Roach Motel, it's called, by the dark pattern people. And that is a dark pattern.
Yeah. So that's the term Roach Hotel is the idea where it's easy to get in but hard to get out. Anyway.
If you have something where there are terms to which you are bound that you didn't clearly see, that would be, that's plausibly a form of sludge, because to get access to it, you have to overcome the friction that is involved in reading small print or finding things that aren't really salient.
Great. And we have a question here from Tim. He asked, would you say that quarterly reports is a form of sludge? Perhaps not by design, but then again, they lead to this insidious short-term corporate thinking. It's kind of the question, if I read it correctly. What's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so there are 2 points. Quarterly reports as opposed to annual reports are sludge. So annual reports are sludge too, just less than quarterly reports. Whether quarterly reports are excessive sludge rather than optimal sludge would depend on the context. So the fact is that to design a report takes effort, and it might be that that diverts people from something that would be a more productive use of their time. So absolutely it's sludge. If quarterly reports lead to short-term thinking, when we need the opposite, that's a plausible view. I'd need to know more to know whether it's true, but it's certainly plausible. That would be a different problem. It would be a form of insidiousness that is independent of the fact that it's sludge.
Right. That's great. And I guess, okay, yeah, it seems like you answered it well. So thanks from Tim. We're going to start to round up a little bit, but I want to close on a more personal note for you and ask you, has there been any nudge in your life that's been very successful in your personal life?
Yes, and I'm thinking, what is the nudge that's been most successful? Let's give you the one that's most salient. So
yeah, sure.
I'm living in Washington, D.C. now, and I play squash, a racket sport in a little room. And the question is, when does one find the time if one has a family and a job? And I have a friend who's basically nudged me to routinize playing on both Saturday and Sunday as a kind of default. And he's succeeded. So I've been here for a number of months, and every Saturday and Sunday I play squash because of my friend who has been a successful deployer of habit formation.
Nice. And in terms of sludge, was there any sludge that in your personal life, for example, made you more motivated to write the book? Was it something that you personally encountered that was, stung the eyes or like felt annoying to experience?
I am at the high end of the distribution in terms of sludge aversion. So there's a research project to be done about how much sludge aversion different people have. There's undoubtedly heterogeneity. I'd say I'm in the top 5%, possibly the top 1%. But it wasn't motivated by any particular incident, though I recalled at all points that a number of years ago, I was offered a subscription to 5 magazines for free for 3 months by my credit card company, and I thought this was great. And so I subscribed to those magazines, and 20 years later, I was still receiving them, and I had been paying for them for 19 years and 9 months because the free subscription was for 3 months, after which it was automatically renewed at the normal rate. And that was a form of sludge. I didn't bother to unsubscribe until I started working for the government and my salary went down. And I thought I should probably unsubscribe.
Right. That's a great example. And we talked about future books and so on. If you had to make a prediction today of a future Udge book, in terms of you had nudge, sludge, there could be maybe budge or something else in the future. Is there something that could happen at some point, another type of variation of this, or shove? I don't know if that's something interesting.
I don't have an idea for anything that falls in that category. So I don't like fudge very much, but I don't think I have a book's worth of, I think all the book would say is fudge is good, and that's too short to be a book. So I don't see an Udge book coming. I did do a little book a few years ago called The World According to Star Wars, which I greatly enjoyed writing. And I didn't get fired by Harvard for writing it, which was a bit of a pleasing surprise because it's not an academic book. But if I had something like that, which could potentially use ideas from social science, including behavioral science, but resonate with a different kind of audience, I would welcome that project.
That's great. And that actually takes me into maybe my last question of sort, because I have for a long time loved your yearly movie awards. Remind me of the name again. I'm actually blanking on the name.
The Beacons, the behavioral Oscars.
Yes, they're always fantastic, and it led me to create a list for my audience of books, or mostly rather movies and TV shows that can help you understand behavior in some way or capacity. With definitely some of the ones that you also referenced there. So how do you think about, being a behavioral scientist? What can you learn from movies or films? Is there anything you can improve from watching films?
Completely. So a number of them show, good ones show a subtle and accurate understanding of the human species, and present bias or unrealistic optimism or poor risk perception are often the stuff out of which art is made. So Shakespeare didn't do randomized controlled trials, but in his plays you can find a lot of the heart, pun intended, of modern behavioral science.
Nice. And I don't know if you want to spoil anything in advance, but is there been any favorite movie this year that you recommend for people to watch?
Well, I've been so involved in government that I haven't been much of a movie goer, but there is a movie that has fun with time travel. I'm blocking on the name, by the great director who did the Batman movies and The Prestige.
You mean Tenet? Is that the one?
That's it. That could easily be an award winner. It's ingenious.
Why do you like that? I'm curious. I love it as well, but I'm curious here. Why do you like it?
It's tricky about counterfactuals and the movement of time.
Yeah.
So I have a government meeting for which I have to excuse myself.
Of course. Yeah, we have definitely been very fortunate to get your time. So thank you so much, Cass. Really appreciate it today. And
really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks all.